All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I think everybody is here. Please, if you need to, get up, get some extra food, help yourselves. Thank you all for being here. As most of you know by now, my name is Wes Kaufman. I'm one of the partners at Heartwood, and we are very excited today to have Michael Barker with us. He is the co-lead at McGuire Woods in their private wealth strategies group, graduate of Georgetown Law, and is an expert in all things estate planning, tax planning, to include charitable gifting and gifting strategies, which is going to be sort of the focus today, although Michael has assured me that if there are other estate planning questions, we'll be happy to get to those as well. So again, thanks for coming, and I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
Sure, thanks so much. Happy to talk about anything we want. As Wes said, I think these types of conversations are typically more fun when they are conversations. I've got a series of PowerPoint slides that we can talk about and go through, but please do not hesitate to interrupt with comments and questions. I think that's often really enjoyable, and I understand that there's some people online as well, so please send in your comments and questions and criticisms, and that'll get passed along and we can jump on through. This is titled Modern Charitable Planning. I think we've got a whole host of things we can talk about with respect to estate planning in the context of philanthropy. We've got here the date of February 2025, which was the initial time when we were going to do this, which turned out to be that snow day. Kept that on there as a good reminder that like 1/8 of an inch in Richmond means we're going to push it a month. So appreciative of everybody still coming out and be willing to participate in this. This is just a high-level series of things that I intend to talk about briefly today, subject to whatever y'all want to talk about. As Wes said, I'm an estate planning lawyer, so there will be a little bit of talk on tax and maybe some nerdy stuff, but also try to be as practical as we can be for whatever's on your mind. I really think when talking to clients about philanthropy and charitable planning, it's easy for lawyers and accountants to jump right to the tax pieces, but philanthropy means different things to different people. Everybody has different goals and objectives, and so I really think that we need to sort of take a more holistic view of things. I often think that in conversations like this, it's helpful to talk about where we are legislatively, what the playing field looks like from tax deductions and things. As many of you may know, the 2017 Tax Act, sometimes called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, or sometimes called the Trump tax cuts, changed some of the structural features both in the estate planning tax world as well as the philanthropic world. And so sometimes it's interesting to think about what has happened in the last 8 years since then. So we can talk about some trends, we can talk about some laws, we can talk about strategies to take advantage of income tax deductions, some strategies to be thoughtful about estate tax planning, and then perhaps finish with some comments around, so you're thinking about starting a family foundation and thinking about what structures you might think about there. So let's start with a little bit of the nerdy tax stuff, just in order to sort of level set from an income tax perspective. When we're thinking about making gifts to qualified charities, oftentimes not the sole, but one consideration in making those charitable gifts is getting an income tax deduction. Those deductions can be limited. There's two primary limitations, as you can see on the slides. The percentage limitation is important for people who are very charitably inclined, very philanthropic, to make sure that you're able to actually utilize all of the deduction that you receive. And then secondly, the valuation limitation, that is one that comes up less often, something that I don't think we need to spend much time on. When I give these types of talks to groups of lawyers, as I often do, whenever I talk to lawyers, I always like to include something I call a malpractice alert. And the valuation limitations are a great malpractice alert because there are times, and they are not always intuitive, where when you give an asset to a charity, your deduction is not equal to the value of the property that you gave to the charity, but you're limited, for instance, to income tax basis value, which often is substantially less. Sometimes a key example is short-term capital gain property. So an asset that you've only owned for a short period of time, you're limited to the income tax basis on those deductions. So for this group, we're less worried about malpractice alerts, and we're more worried about if you're giving an asset of appreciated property, make sure you talk to your accountant, lawyer, financial advisor team. The Heartwood folks are well versed in some of this stuff and can at least make sure you think through those issues so that you are not surprised. The percentage limitations can be more directly impactful, as I say, for folks who are very charitably inclined or who have a year of lower income. So if you're a person whose income varies from time to time, sometimes we're always trying to match income and deductions in the same year, and being thoughtful about what those limitations are. The big one that changed with the 2017 Tax Act was the increase in the limitation for cash gifts to public charities, which was previously limited to 50% of your adjusted gross income, which is just sort of your top line income on your tax return, went up to 60% to try to facilitate more charitable giving. The 30% limitation, I think, is an important one because it applies to appreciated property. As we'll talk about, I think gifts of appreciated property, which oftentimes is low basis marketable securities and stocks, that can be a really meaningful way to make charitable gifts. And so making sure you're thoughtful about that 30% limitation as you're doing your planning can be helpful. If you go over these limitations, as you can see them all, the 5-year carry forward is also helpful to remember. And your accountant has probably talked to you about that in the past, where if you give away, say, an asset that is equal to 100% of your income that year, well, you're going to be limited to some portion of it. So you're not going to be able to use the entire deduction that year, but you'll be able to carry it forward in your next returns for the next 5 years. So you sort of have 6 years to soak up that deduction. Perhaps enough on detailed tax things. Let's talk a little bit about the 2017 Tax Act. As I say, sometimes it's helpful to level set what the playing field is and what where we are generally. One of the 2017 Tax Act, as you know, had a whole host of changes to the income tax rules, to the gift tax rules, estate tax rules. Some of the ones that are important for our context today was the increase in the standard deduction. The standard deduction is now $30,000 for married taxpayers, which I think means that only something like 10% of American taxpayers now itemize their deductions. Something like 90% are now just taking the standard deduction rather than itemization. And why does that matter for our context? Well, charitable deductions are only important if you itemize your deductions in order to take them. So fewer people are economically incentivized by the tax rules to make smaller charitable contributions. General reduction in the income tax rates, right? That's just generally around the margins for individuals, dropped a few percentage points, but less beneficial marginally to get a charitable deduction when the tax rates go down. The other big one is that impacted the estate planning world significantly was the doubling of the estate and gift tax exemptions amount. So it went from $5 million to $10 million indexed for inflation per person. So your estate and gift tax exemption amount is just shy of $14 million per person, $28 million for a married couple. And so that means that the first $28 million that a married couple owns are not subject to estate tax. Anything over that is subject to the 40% estate tax. But as we'll talk about, estate tax is optional for philanthropic people. I put on here what's the future of the 2017 Tax Act. I will say, as I said to Sarah a few minutes ago, like I am done guessing what Congress is going to do. The 2017 Tax Act, due to the pay-for rules that required an automatic sunset, meaning that the Tax Act will go away at the end of this year unless Congress affirmatively acts to change the rules this calendar year. Most people believe that given the outcome of the elections in November, that we now have a Republican Congress that would be interested in extending those tax cuts. I think if we know from our friends in Washington that if all they wanted to do was pass extenders and say, hey, let's just take that 2017 Tax Act and push it out, they could probably push it out for 3 or 4 years without having to worry but so much about the pay-fors. And so we know that the Senate Finance Committee nonpartisan staff members have already drafted that extender legislation. The question's going to be in Congress is what things are going to be in addition to the extending the 2017 Tax Act, and will there be agreement on those between the House and the Senate, and what kind of various agreements they're going to have to be made with respect to that. It's been a nice, as everyone knows, it's been a nice, quiet couple of months in D.C. Not much has happened. I think a lot of estate planning professionals were hopeful, might be the right word, or optimistic that we would have seen tax extender legislation at the beginning of the administration. Has not happened, of course. It does not appear to be the primary driver of the administration's immediate objectives. Whether or not it's going to be something that sort of gets slipped through in the summertime during the doldrum times, maybe so, or maybe we're going to come down to the wire and going to have to be thinking about a ton of year-end planning for people to make gifts to use their exemptions before it goes away. But as I say, I am no longer going to be making those guesses. But I do think that the higher exemption matters because it's a fairly common thing for folks to say, all right, if my wife and I have $28 million that we can pass to our 2 boys, 14 for each of them feels maybe perhaps like enough. And after that, I got to start paying 40% to DC, and I really don't like taxation. And so maybe I'll just say, let me get that 28 down to the kids, and everything else I'll leave to charity. That's a pretty common technique, but I think fewer and fewer people need to do that as the exemptions have gone up. So we will see what has happened and what will happen. What's the impact of these changes? There's been some initial studies that tell us sort of what has happened. The concern, of course, especially with the standard deduction increase, the concern from the charitable world was that there was going to be a reduction in the amount of money that was given to charity, which recent studies that came out in 2023 and 2024 said was true, except for the bump during 2020 and early 2021 when there was a lot of philanthropic activity around COVID times and related things that were happening in the world. There has, in fact, been a substantial reduction in charitable giving since 2018. I think that's a little bit hard to parse how much of that's tax-driven. We've been in a volatile economic market, which Wes could tell you all about, but I think I've been hearing threat of recession probably for the last I don't know how long. And obviously we've had some political uncertainty. I saw in the paper yesterday that consumer confidence is at a really low from a really long time. So I don't know how much of it's tax-driven and how much of it is otherwise driven, but some of the concerns did, in fact, come to pass. And a lot of that has been in the smaller charitable giving range. I think we haven't seen a huge reduction in the $10 million gifts, in the $100 million gifts. I think what we're seeing now that the standard deduction is so high and that charitable deductions really are only for people, high income earners, we're seeing a reduction in the $1,000 to $5,000 to $10,000 gift range, which for some charities, that's their lifeblood. And so there has been some reduction in that. So it'll be interesting to see whether that trend holds true. Some of this here on the slide I talked about briefly. The number of itemizers has gone way down. So that sort of sets the table for where we are. And I've been maybe monologuing now for a while. Let me pause if anybody has any comments or questions on that, and then we can keep it rolling.
What's the standard deduction for single? Sorry.
I don't know off the top of my head. Y'all may know. Yeah, the question was, what's the standard deduction for single folks? I think it's about half of the married number. Yeah, 15. So that makes sense. Was there another comment too?
Has the gross dollars decreased, or just the profile of givers?
Yeah, so the question was, has the gross total giving, charitable giving in America decreased? Yes. The gross amount has gone down, and like I say, the segment is in that sort of lower end gifting segment.
Could you not go to like the Fidelity Giving Fund and bump it big one year so you get the deduction and then just use that money as needed?
Yeah, so the question is, hey, let's talk about donor advised funds. And I say, give me about 20 minutes. Donor advised funds are terrific vehicles, and for people who are not worried, you're saying, hey, there was some limitations on AGI, and you say, I've got the opposite problem. I've got a big year of income. I just sold my business. I just got a big pension payment. I just got whatever. I got a lot of income this year. What can I do? One thing I can do is slug my money into a foundation that I control, make a big gift, load up deductions in a high income year. I don't have to pass that money out to operating charities until I want to. You could do that with a donor advised fund. You could do that with a private family foundation. And absolutely, that's a really good strategic idea that we should definitely talk about. Another comment there?
Yeah, question. In the event that the 2017 tax laws are not extended and or changed, what does it default to?
Oh, good question. Thank you. The question was, what happens if we do not get extenders on the 2017 Tax Act and it sunsets? For the exemptions, which I think was the crux of your question, we're up at this $10 million number, which has indexed for inflation up to 14. They will go back to the $5 million number index for inflation, which would be 7. So with inflation, it'll probably drop to 7.25 or whatever you think is going to happen with inflation this year. But it gets cut in half because it got doubled. That's another good question. Others?
If you already have a donor advised fund, you can just donate more to it, right? There's no...
That's correct. The question is, if you've got a donor advised fund, you can donate money to it anytime you want. And the answer is absolutely yes. It is intended to be sort of and we'll talk about this, it's intended to be sort of a substitute for a private foundation, and works in that same way. It is deemed to be, for purposes of those limitations that we talked about, your donor advised fund is a gift to a public charity. And so those, you can make gifts to public charities anytime you want. It's a good question. Okay, so let's talk about, let's move quickly through the next slide, which I think is a little bit repetitive of where we are and have talked about. I think the first bullet is the thing that I preach to all of my young associates when they start, which is having the right conversations with clients and not jumping right to the tax stuff, but talking about what is really motivating you, because I think with highly charitably inclined folks, we haven't actually seen any reduction in that. Well, I want to talk about gifts of retirement assets, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And gifts of appreciated property, as I said, are really important. But let's talk about some strategies. I think I can tell that we're sort of ready to get there. Okay, let's start simple. Outright gifts, and this is, appreciated securities is the wheelhouse here, right? Outright gifts to operating charities or to your donor advised fund or family foundation. Those outright gifts, to your Red Cross, your church, whatever, those are so easy. They're the most common types of charities. One of the things that we think about, gift those appreciated securities, right? If you have shares of Philip Morris that you inherited from your mother 50 years ago, don't sell those and then give the cash to the charity. Give those shares to the charity. The charity can sell them without any income tax consequences. You get the full fair market value deduction for that. I've included in here a little bit about Restricted gifts. Sometimes we hear from clients that gift contingencies and restrictions are important. You know, I'm going to give the university $1 million, but I'd require that they're going to put my name on the library. Those types of restrictions are harder and harder and harder to enforce. The trend in the law is to give those charities more freedom to be able to do what they want. Where you started to see it happen was sort of call it a generation ago. Some of the Gilded Age gifts were kind of coming into fruition, and you had things that just didn't make sense anymore. You know, gifts to the school of, you know, buggy whips. You know, we don't need those anymore, right? And so the schools were able to get changes to that. So what I always say is gift agreements are a great way. If you want to have a restriction, like I want to give the University of Richmond $1 million, but I don't want them to be able to use it on anything other than the law school. Get you a gift agreement in there. Does that guarantee you that you and your family will always be able to enforce it? No, but it does give you a lot more enforceability than if you don't have one. If you don't have one, you don't have any right to enforce it, and you're just relying on the charity to do as you've asked or have the Attorney General enforce it for you. So I think that's a helpful context for people who that's important to them. Yeah?
So if you do have a desire to do something like that, who does the gift agreement? Are the development offices kind of set up to do that, or should you get an attorney?
They'll certainly give you one.
Yeah, I'm sure they will.
I don't know if that's the one you want.
Right.
And so I think that's probably worth talking to your counsel about, because the gift agreement you're going to get from the charity, and that's nothing against charities, but that gift agreement is going to say that if it's impractical or doesn't make sense, that they can move it as they deem appropriate. And then whose discretion is what makes sense is totally up to them. And so you're going to want to find your way through and maybe make some modifications. And if the gift is meaningful to them, they're almost certainly going to be willing to play ball a little bit on that. That's a terrific question. But you know, we've seen a lot, I think, in the last 5 or more years. You know, names are coming off of buildings, you know, for good reasons and bad reasons. And, you know, things are being changed, money's being moved around, and that's just where we are in the law right now. So all the more sort of reason to be thoughtful about what that is. Yeah, comment in the back.
Under gift agreements, if you're specifically funding a scholarship fund for whoever earns the scholarship, the school decides should get the money. Does that come under a gift agreement, or is that a separate kind of arrangement?
Yeah, good question. The question was, if you have a gift, if you're making a gift to fund a scholarship, should you have a gift agreement? And yes, probably, if you care, right? And it's not everybody cares. If your scholarship is, you know, I want it to be for, you know, a law student, and I want it to be for somebody who's, you know, from the western part of the state, or, you know, the types of restrictions that people have. If you care about that, then you should probably have some type of agreement. If it's just, hey, I want to make a scholarship so that somebody can go, and I trust the university to pick the right people, then whatever they give you is probably going to be fine for that. Does that answer your question reasonably? I think and I don't want to overstate it. Most of our clients do have gift agreements just because it's common in the context for big gifts, but it's certainly not something that you have to overthink or overwork. Bargain sales, I think, are a helpful type of strategy to talk about, just because I think it doesn't usually get enough press or thought in the charitable planning world. You know, there's that old adage from 1990s hip hop that says, ain't no such thing as halfway crooks. Well, you can be a halfway philanthropist. If you have a parcel of real estate, let's say you've got your house at the river that you want to sell because you're not going down there anymore, and you say, oh, but I also would like to give a scholarship at the university, rather than selling the house, taking all that gain into your income, and then giving cash, you can sell it cheap to the university, let them turn around and sell it. The difference between its fair market value and what you sell them to it for is a charitable gift, and the rest of it never sort of came into, for which you get a deduction, and the rest of it never came into income. And so we don't have to spend too much time on that, but always something good to think about. What about the charitable gift annuity? The charitable gift annuity, I think, was popular in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s more than it is today. But I still think y'all probably get mail from charities you support that talk about the ability to do this. The idea of a charitable gift annuity is that you give a big dollar amount to the charity, and then over time they give money back to you. And people think of it like, okay, I'm going to give the charity I care about $1 million, and then they'll give me some cash flow coming back. And people sort of use that as a way to benefit a capital campaign if the charity needs a bunch of cash right now, knowing that, sort of think of it as supplemental income to your retirement or other things. The reasons that people do it, I've listed there: security of fixed payments and other things. But really the play is that a portion of the payment is excluded from income. Depending on the interest rates applicable at the time of the gift, you're going to get a charitable deduction for some piece of it. And then when money comes back, some piece of that payment from the charity to you is excluded from income because it's charitable. And so you can see higher interest rates increase the charitable deduction and decrease the amount that's excluded. So you could flip that and say lower interest rates decrease the deduction but increase the inclusion ratio. We sort of have this time now where interest rates are neither high nor low particularly. So it's sort of, you get the middle ground there. Any comments about bargain sales or CGAs? Can step up the complexity a little bit and talk about CRTs. You're probably familiar with the charitable remainder trust. It's a type of charitable trust. It is designed for income tax benefits. Said briefly, the idea of a charitable remainder trust is if I have a big slug of something that I want to diversify in my portfolio. So for instance, I use the example, I've got $5 million worth of zero basis Philip Morris stock that I inherited from my mom in the 60s. And I'm not so sure how it's going to go in the future, and my financial people say that I need to diversify that. But I'm like, oh gosh, if I do that, I'm going to have to pay capital gains tax. Well, I've also been thinking about, I'm charitably inclined and I want to do some philanthropy. Maybe there's a way to skin both of those cats, and that's the charitable remainder trust. Charitable remainder trust is a trust that is a charity. So it is a nonprofit organization that is not subject to income tax. So when you put money into it, you put that low basis stock in there, and then when it sells, it itself is not subject to income tax. So there's no capital gains that are incurred to it. The way that it works is that you put assets in and you retain for your lifetime or a term of years, usually it's lifetime or 2 lifetimes for married people, you retain the right to receive payments back. So you might say, I'm going to put in this stock, I'm going to have it pay back to me 5% or whatever the number is that we'd run some calculations. I'm going to get 5% of the value back during my life. And when this money comes back to you, those little pieces of capital gains that got ignored here come back to you slowly over time if you survive, such that you have not fully gotten not paid capital gains. You can't fully avoid it, but boy, you're paying it out over a 20-year period or whatever would make sense. And so it's a really nice income tax play. And then so you're getting this 5% or 7% or whatever you choose during your lifetime, and then at your death, the remainder goes to the charity that you have selected. So that's why it's a charitable remainder trust, because at the remainder, it goes to charity. So as I said in the slides, there's some complex legal, tax, and accounting things that go along with these. So they're not for small gifts. But if you have something substantial and you do want to diversify it, this can be a pretty powerful way to do it. There's a lot of details in ways you can do this to be strategic. You can retain the power to change the charities during your lifetime, which people always ask me, and I always say, if you don't include it in the trust document, you can't do it, but let's include it because you want to have that flexibility, because you don't know 20 years from now if the organization you support is going to be what you think it is, and so that's meaningful. Some of this we've already sort of talked about, and I think a lot of times what people are attempting to do is sort of when they're picking the amount that comes back to them, that unit trust or annuity piece, you're oftentimes trying to mix what cash flow do I need, what charitable deduction do I want or need at this time, because you get a charitable deduction for the value of the remainder interest. And that's calculated based on actuarial tables. So you can run some numbers, and frequently we'll just give clients some simple spreadsheets that say, like, here's what your deduction would be if you did this, here's what your cash flow would look like with some assumptions. And that can be a helpful thing, and these people can run those numbers for you in really healthy and helpful ways.
So if you, let's just say you had a big pot of money, and we'll just make the numbers easy, and it was earning 10% internally on dividends or whatever, and you took out half of it to come to you, then the other 5% that it earned internally would be deductible against the 5% you took out. Is that what you said?
The question, I won't repeat the question. The question was around how does the deduction work? No, the deduction works that is the fair market value of what you put in at the time, not related to the earnings of it as it goes. So remember, the CRT itself is a charity, so the earnings doesn't matter because it's not subject to it. But the way that it works is if I put $1 million in there and I say, okay, and it's for my lifetime, I'm 45 years old, my life expectancy according to these tables is however many years it is, and I'm taking out 5% or I'm taking out 7%, I can sort of run those actuarial tables against the expected number of years, and the IRS will say, okay, based on your the amount you're taking out and your age, we expect that you'll receive, of the $1 million, we expect you'll receive $400,000, and accordingly you get a deduction for $600. That's how the deduction works. Good question, very good question.
Are these?
Yeah.
Are these, let's say you don't live to 90 or 80, whatever your life expectancy is.
Sure.
Is this sort of more of a gamble?
Terrific question. The question was, is this a gamble based on your life expectancy? I would probably say no. Certainly the amount that comes back to you is highly dependent upon how long you live. But if you are not living, you don't need the cash flow. I mean, I don't want to, that's maybe more theological than we should get into today. Probably you don't need the cash flow, at least on this earth, right? So but then your partner you would probably do it as a dual life so that it doesn't go to charity until the surviving spouse passes. Mm-hmm. Where the gamble comes in that I didn't say when we were talking about charitable gift annuities, these are the gamble. This is where the charity is playing the lottery with how long is my donor going to live. Because I'm going to get $1 million from them, and I'm going to promise to pay them a fixed dollar amount every year. And so if they live for a long time, the charity, I'm going to lose money. And if they die in the near term, I'm going to make money. And so when I'm advising charities about these types of things, that is always the first thing I talk about, is that you're playing the lotto with the donor's life expectancy. And the thing that I always tell them is, don't forget that wealthy old ladies live a long time. And then the second half of that is that mean wealthy old ladies live forever. So let's go to the final piece here on charitable remainder trusts, which I don't think we need to go into the huge details here, but this is intended to show you that the charitable remainder trust has a ton of bells and whistles that you can add to it. You can really play around with how much money you get, when you get it, and how you design it. And so we sort of talked about it in the general sense of I'm going to take 5% a year out. Well, I can also do it where I only get the income. And so if I don't really need it, I can say I'll only get the income. The idea of that is that now I'm letting it grow for charity or grow for me later. And then I can do sort of a flip CRUT, which is where I can flip on getting more money out. So I can say I'm only going to take the small amount of income, but then I can get more income at some triggering event, such as when I turn 65 years old for my retirement, now it's going to pay me a lot more money out. I only took the income while I was still working because I had that income, and now that I flip it at whatever age I pick, now it's paying me out a lot more money to sort of replace that. So that's why I say retirement planning, planning for a surviving spouse, which is, I think, to your point, or some grandparents use it for education planning for kids, grandkids. So that's it for charitable remainder trusts. Other questions and comments on that topic? Otherwise, we'll keep it moving. Cool. Let's sort of switch gears as the nature of the conversation. We've been talking a lot about income tax charitable deductions. That's what the CRT is all about, getting that income tax planning, selling an asset, not paying the capital gains or delaying the capital gains, income tax planning. Let's talk for a minute about estate tax planning. Estate tax planning, especially for those with taxable estates, which, as we identified currently, is people who have more than 14 million or 28 million for a married couple. In the future, don't know what that's going to be if Congress doesn't act. That'll be for people with more than 7 or 7.5 or whatever it ends up being indexed for inflation. As I said at the beginning and previewed, the estate tax is fully optional. Every asset that you leave to charity is not subject to the estate tax, full stop. It's an unlimited estate tax deduction. The one thing that we've got to be careful with is that the charitable bequest amount, in order to get the charitable deduction, must be fully ascertainable at the time of death. So this is another one of those that might be, for lawyers, a malpractice alert. For you is a please talk to your advisors alert. If you're going to be doing charitable planning in your will or your trust, please make sure you're talking to a professional who can help you through that. The cautionary tale that I like to tell people is a case in the tax court from 1991 called the Price case. The Price case is a terrific cautionary tale because the result is correct under the interpretation of the law, but a really bad result for taxpayers. Let me give you the short version. So, decedent had an estate plan that said, I'm leaving all of my money to, I think it was the church or charity of some kind. I'm leaving everything to charity. And it was a substantial estate, $10 million or something back in the 90s. And then, just before he died, he attached a short amendment to his will that said, I have had so many kind nurses that have come through and helped me in my elderly years, but I don't remember who they all are. So I direct my executor to be able to give up to $100. So this is a person worth millions of dollars, and it was, can give up to $100 to any of these nurses as the executor deems fit. The tax court said, the IRS argued and the tax court agreed that whether the executor gave one $100 gift or 4 $100 gifts or 10 $100 gifts means we don't know the exact amount at the time of death that's going to go to charity. So no charitable deduction for any of it. So all was subject to the estate tax at full estate tax rates, even though it all went to charity. And as a practical matter, I think in the facts of the case, only a couple of people got their $100. So that is the terrific cautionary tale, because he left millions to charity and still paid millions of estate tax. So just be very careful as you're working through your will to make sure that you're following all of those, all the rules. And if you're thinking about, let's make sure we don't do any of those foot faults in our own estate plans. Comments or questions there? Let's talk about charitable lead trusts. Charitable lead trusts is sort of the flip of the charitable remainder trust. It is not an income tax play. The charitable lead trust is not a charity. It is an estate tax play. Some of you may be familiar with GRATs or have talked to your financial people about GRATs. A charitable lead trust is a GRAT for charity. Let's walk through how it works very briefly. The idea of a charitable lead trust is getting assets down a generation without paying gift or estate tax on it. So getting assets from me to my kids tax-free. These types of plans are really meaningful for people who don't have any more gift tax exemption. You say, hey, I've already used all my $28 million of my exemption during my lifetime. Now what do I do to reduce my estate so I pay less estate tax? Now what do I do to benefit the kids? What you can do is a charitable lead trust. The idea of a charitable lead trust is, I'll use easy math just because lawyers should not do math. But let's say that we put $1 million in a charitable lead trust. We say it's a term of years, and let's say it's a 10-year charitable lead trust. As a practical matter, you would run some spreadsheets like we were talking about, and you'd think about what makes sense for you. But just to simplify, let's say we put $1 million in, and we're saying it's a 10-year trust. The way that the trust would work is that it would pay $100,000 in each of the 10 years to the charity of your choosing, right? So you've put in $1 million, and $1 million has gone to charity. So the value of the gift, according to the IRS, is $0. At the end of the 10 years, once you've given $1 million to charity, what if the assets inside the trust, what if the market's done well or the asset you have is done well? What if that's turned in those 10 years from $1 million to $1.6 million? Now you've got $1 million to charity, you just got $600,000 to the kids, and you did not pay any gift tax on getting it down there. So that's the idea of the charitable lead trust. Again, it's an estate planning play. It's not an income tax planning play. The idea is moving assets down a generation. We can give you a few more details here. Who should do a charitable lead trust? I think you have to have maybe 2 or 3 things. One, you have to have true philanthropic intent. And I say that because there's a lot of people in the estate planning community who push these types of trusts for people who don't really care about charity just because they think that they can be good planning techniques. I think you do have to have true philanthropic intent, which you came to this event, so you probably fit that bill. And then the other piece that you have to have is kids who already have enough money. Right? A lot of times what we're doing with these types of trusts is we can do them, as I say, today. You could do one today. You could also put one in your will. You could have a will that says, hey, at my death, all of my assets or some portion of my assets pass to a charitable lead trust. And then the next 10 years happens, right? But you've got to have kids that already have money. Otherwise, they're saying, wait a minute, mom just kicked the bucket and I was waiting for my money for the last 60 years and now I don't get it. But if you have kids who are independently launched because they're doctors or they've already received gifts from you during your lifetime and it's okay for them to wait, that's the ideal client profile. And it, as I said, typically works well for folks who can't just make gifts, right? You've already used your exemption. So these things work really well in low interest rate environments. I told you I simplified the math and said you put $1 million in and it gives 10% over 10 years. As it actually happens, there's an interest rate that's applicable to it, and the growth that goes to the kids is the growth above the interest rate at the time you create the trust. So we were doing a ton of these in 2020, for instance, when interest rates, the applicable interest rate was less than 1%. And people like Wes were saying like, well, the market's crazy, but I think I can do better than 1%. And so really advantageous in low interest rate environments, but it's the market that drives it. Questions or comments there?
What happens if the value of what you placed into the trust, if the market drops and it's no longer sufficient to fund that annuity commitment?
Yeah, good question. The question was, what happens in a charitable lead trust if the value goes down and it's not sufficient to fund the commitment? Then the trust, all the trust assets go to the charity, the trust terminates, and the kids or other beneficiaries get nothing. No, that's a great question. The follow-up question was, there's no reaching back into the estate and said, wait a minute, you told me I was going to get a full $1 million, I didn't. No, it is not. It just, the charity gets the percentage that it gets, and if that's the full funding, great. If not, they're still happy to get the money. So it is, and you got, you got the money to the charity, and that is what it is. So that's a good question. Others? We've got a few minutes left to talk about the concept of, so you want to create a family foundation. Sounds like many of you already have donor advised funds or are familiar with that topic. So we don't have to spend but so much time on it. But the idea is, when I'm talking to clients about funding a family charity, a bucket, a structure that will manage multi-generationally the philanthropic resources that we have, you typically have two primary options. You've got the private foundation and you've got the donor advised fund. The private foundation, I will say, has lost some popularity over time as the rise of donor advised funds has come. I think if we had had this conversation 20 years ago, the initial questions that we had about DAFs would have been about private foundations, because that's what people did. But donor advised funds are so easy. What's the private foundation is total family control. I control the foundation. I create either a trust or I create a corporation. I've got on here, why would you choose one or the other? If I create a trust that's the private foundation charity, the terms of that trust are really hard to change. So if my philanthropic goals are specific and meaningful to me, and I perhaps worry less meaningful to my children who I want to run the charity, but I don't trust to always make the same things that I would make, then I build it in the concept of a trust, and I say, hey, it has to go to, pick whatever's important to you. It has to go to education. It has to go to environmental. It has to go to religious. Whatever it is that is meaningful to you, you can build that in the context of a trust. Typically, though, we like to do in the context of a corporation, much more common, much more flexibility. Corporations change their bylaws all the time. So if you're less worried about, hey, it's got to be for specific purposes, and more worried about, I want my kids to be able to get along, I want the cousins to be able to get along as they're managing this bucket, then you want that flexibility. Private foundations are not as prevalent as they once were, or as attractive as they once were, given the administrative burden. They require informational tax returns. One thing that's fun to do if you're ever looking for something fun to do is go on an organization like GuideStar and look at the tax returns for charities you're interested in. That can be really fun to do, and you can say, like, I didn't know that guy was on the board, or can you believe they gave that money over there? It's really fun to do. The closely regulated to avoid self-dealing. There are a lot of limitations on what private foundations can do. When you're thinking about private foundations, you might think about like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and you might think about like the Trump Foundation and other things. That one was sort of in the news a lot when he got in trouble while he was president for having his foundation purportedly not do what it was supposed to do, and he had to put some money back because the foundation was buying, I think the foundation was like buying champagne for him or something. I forget the details. But that was, so you've got to be really careful when doing these. Don't create a private foundation without good legal counsel would be my advice on that. There is also the 5% distribution requirement. So money that's in a private foundation, the benefit is you fully control it. But one thing to think about is, unlike the question earlier about hey, in my donor advised fund, I don't have to pay out anything to anybody unless I want to. In a private foundation, 5% of the assets have to be paid out to operating charities on an annual basis. Then this question of minimum value. So you've got all of this administrative burden, like, hey, if I'm going to put $10,000 in a charity, I'm not going to create a private foundation, right? That's it. This structure probably needs a big gift attached to it. I think if you ask 10 lawyers what the minimum value should be, or a rule of thumb, if you ask 10 lawyers, you probably get like 11 or 12 different answers. I often say to clients, my rule of thumb is, client to client, but I think 10 million is probably the bottom. It might be 20, just because I think some of it depends on how important control is to you. If control is really, really, really important to you, then I'd maybe slide that number a little far south. If control is not so important to you, then I'd push it all the way north. And that's partially because donor advised funds are so easy to use. It sounds like some of you are very familiar with them. For those that aren't, the idea is it is a fund that operates like a private family foundation, except it's a fund at a bigger organization. The community foundations have them. All financial institutions have them. Schwab and Fidelity and others that have funds that are attached to them. They are public charities, and so your gifts to them, you don't have a informational tax return requirement because it's a public charity. You don't have any sort of management. You don't have to have meetings. You can just sort of do whatever you want. You don't have to pay 5%. You could put $100 million into a donor advised fund tomorrow, and it could sit there for 100 years and nobody would ever have to make any charitable contributions under the rules. Yes?
Some of them do have you have to do a gift every few years.
But so that's a good point. That's their own requirement, not the legal requirement. And you can always find somebody who's willing to let you do whatever you want if the money's enough. Yeah. You lose legal control, right? The investment control, although those rules have softened up a little bit, and you can put in a donor advised fund and still have your investment advisors advise on it, which is really good. It used to be that you could not, but that's advising as to grants. We'll talk about that shortly. Skipping to the bottom, unlikely to be perpetual, I think is important. Most of those donor advised funds have policies and procedures that say hey, you can be involved with it, maybe your kids, maybe your grandkids, but not forever. Whereas, those private foundations, we still have private foundations in America that are from our founding days, right? That you can have sort of last for perpetual. Advising as to grants. This is something that is really important to a lot of clients, so maybe worth spending a moment on. When you are in full control of your private foundation, you have to give 5% out, but you get to decide who, and nobody can tell you otherwise as long as it's a charity, a legally defined charity. With donor advised funds, as a legal matter, they're called donor advised. As a legal matter, it's the charity that determines where the grants go out from. And you can merely advise. So that's the legal matter, but let me take one step back and say, as a practical matter, if you are telling the donor advised fund, the Fidelities or the community foundations of the world, hey, I want to give $10,000 to that university and $10,000 to that church and $10,000 to the Red Cross and that to the hospital, they do it. They do whatever you want. When I give this talk around to lawyers, which I have done probably dozens of times, I will often ask the room, has anybody ever had a donor advised fund where a client tried to make a contribution to charity and the organization said no? First of all, I'll say I have zero experience with that. I've never had that happen to a client. And in all the times that I've talked to lawyers, I had one lawyer tell me once after a meeting that in the early 2000s, he had a client who wanted to make a contribution to a religious organization that it turned out was on a terrorist watch list. And the financial institution said, we're not going to let you make that contribution to something that's on the terrorist watch list. That is the only limitation, right? Like the only limitation is if your charity is on the terrorist watch list, you might not be able to. Otherwise, as a practical matter, they always do whatever you want. And the ones like Fidelity, sir, I think you said you have that, like you don't even have to talk to a human anymore. You just like push some buttons and it goes, right? Technically, as a legal matter, some committee backstairs is approving that, but it just kind of happens. And so I would say that those limitations are a little bit more, they're concerning to people who really, really like control. And so I think it's important to think about, but is something that very rarely comes into play. Very, very, very rarely. Future of donor advised funds. Yes, sir, comment.
What happens if you have a sum of money in your donor advised fund and you die?
Yeah, good question. The question is, what happens if you have money in your donor advised fund and you die? Most of the donor advised funds, when you create it, when you put money in it, you sign a donor agreement of some kind. And usually you list in that agreement who your successor advisors are. So whether that's the kids or whether that's your spouse or your sibling or whatever, usually there's a series of people who will step in to designating the charitable recipients. What I alluded to before is usually with donor advised funds, at some point there's a cutoff, and you can't let it go around forever. And so if there's money left over, if you are the kid, say, and the agreement says we're only letting 2 generations and you're the second generation, so it's going to end when you die. I've had conversations with clients about, hey, you should probably think about moving that money out to charities you care about, because if you're the last advisor and you die, then the money usually, according to the agreement, sort of gets sucked into the charity writ large and gets used for charitable purposes, has to be used for charitable purposes under the law, but like the community foundation would then be in charge of advising where that money goes. Good, very good question. Yes, another question.
With the financial institution, what happens to it?
Same thing, those financial institutions, when they say you're at Schwab or you're at Fidelity, you're technically at a Schwab charity that has been approved by the IRS as a charity and accordingly must use its money for charitable purposes. And so the funds will be added to that bucket and then be distributed out to charities.
So mine did with Bessemer Trust, so then Bessemer would get it and would go into their trust and they'd give it away.
So yours is at Bessemer. Bessemer has, I don't know the inner workings, but Bessemer has, the legal entity is not just Bessemer, because Bessemer is a private, for-profit organization. So there's a Bessemer charity at the end of the, and you can talk to your people there and say, like, hey, do we have the backup advisors right? That's a worthwhile thing to do. But at the end, yes, if there's money in there and no advisor left, it gets sort of sucked into the charity writ large. Mm-hmm.
The only negative I don't see
What goes
is
down, but not forever.
Well, hold on. I'm sorry. Go back to, what was you had a follow-up?
Yeah, no, we've given successors, but I mean, if it.
Yeah, and as I say, I think, yeah, the comment. No. So your comment is, does it ever get to become the money of the in your instance, the Bessemer Trust is owned by the Phipps, or Fidelity is a publicly, like, does it ever become shareholder money? No.
Oh, okay.
It has to be, stays and used for charitable purposes. But again, if you should be very careful to make sure that you've listed the right successors and that those people, and you can look and you can see how many generations they'll give you. Bessemer might give you some more than others, given that that's sort of their business model is long term. So,
Okay, thank you.
yeah, you had a comment. You said a downside.
The only downside I've seen is some smaller charities, if they have not listed with Fidelity or one of these funds, they have to fill out paperwork to be included.
That's interesting.
It's hard to give to some of these charities if they haven't done the legwork to get into their system.
And I'll repeat the comment, but that is also a function of having one at the financial institution, right? At big financial institutions, you have to deal perhaps with a little bit more rigmarole. The comment was that at some of the financial institution donor advised funds, to be able to push the button to move some money over there to a charity, the charity has to be on the list of approved charities. If that was, so yes, maybe they have to fill out some paperwork.
So you can, just another comment on that. As the donor, I know this is for a fact that Fidelity, you can actually recommend to Fidelity to add a certain charity to the list. And normally, as long as they're a 501c3 in good standing, it will get added. It just takes a couple weeks to do that. Because I've actually added one
terrific.
myself. So you can do it. It just takes a couple weeks.
That's helpful. And I would say that's perhaps a downside. I would say the real downside that I see with donor advised funds is I'm not sure what the future of them will be. There has already been legislation introduced in Congress to limit donor advised funds or otherwise change the rules applicable to donor advised funds. You've already seen, for instance, the changes that have happened with university endowments, and that endowments are now subject to an endowment tax, right? Because the concern among legislators, I think if I could articulate it, would be, why does Harvard University have a gazillion dollars that people get to put all this charitable deductions and it just sits there? They're not using it for Harvard University. The only people making money off it are the hedge fund managers who are managing the dang money, right? That's the criticism. Not taking a position on it, but what I would say is that the concern for people who are doing really large donor advised funds is that if your plan with a donor advised fund is that it's supposed to be large and supposed to be long term, you might think about doing a private foundation where all of that brain damage about all the limitations already happened in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, so we know what the rules are. Because I think that may be coming. If you could predict what Congress would do in the future, I would not be in this job, right? I'd be doing something in Vegas perhaps. But I would say that the tide seems to be, the criticism of donor advised funds is the same as that with endowments, which is, you mean I can get an immediate charitable deduction for putting millions of dollars in a donor advised fund, and so that money is never getting to the government, and it's also never getting into the charitable sphere. It's just sitting there at Fidelity, and so the only people making money on it are Fidelity. Why should they get a charitable deduction for that if they're not going to push some money out? So I wouldn't be surprised in the immediate term, in the next, call it 5-10 years, to see changes that require donor advised funds to pay out 5% like private foundations. I also wouldn't be surprised if that sentiment continues to see other big limitations on it that end up making you feel essentially like a private foundation. And if you were going to do that, you might as well have had control of it. So something to think about. I mean, again, if your plan is to put $1 million in there, go for it. It's terrific. If your plan is maybe bigger, you can think about private foundations. I know we've sort of come to the hour, so I want to be mindful of time. Are there other thoughts and comments from the group? Yeah.
So if you, say you give to a dozen charities, you have a donor advised fund, and you give to, say, a dozen charities every year. In your will, you want at least some of that money to go to them. So if you pick a percentage of your whole estate to go to those charities, do you put that in the donor advised fund for your successor to distribute?
The question was, if you know you want a specific group of charities to receive your inheritance, in your will, should you send it to a donor advised fund and then try to put an agreement with the donor advised fund to limit that it can only go to certain charities? Or should your will just say send it to the charities? Just send it to the charities. Unless your plan is, hey, I've got I think you said a group of a dozen. I've got a group of a dozen charities that I really care about, but I don't know if, I don't know what amounts make sense. Yeah, they don't need to split it equally. Then, and I want my kids to be able to make that decision over time, then maybe you send the money to the donor advised fund, let the kids roll in and sort of decide how to go and try to limit how you do it. But that's harder to do. So if you're certain as to what you want, I would just do what you want.
Well, the state couldn't send the money to the donor advised fund.
Sure.
After you died, in your will, you could say, this money goes to the donor advised fund.
Yes, sir. The question is a donor advised fund a charity that can be a beneficiary under a will? The answer is absolutely 100% yes. Private foundations, charitable lead trusts, donor advised funds, all of those things can be beneficiaries under a will. Yes, sir.
If you, say you set one of these up and you've got an ongoing giving plan, but you don't really want to fool around with it with your kids later on, you just want it to, could you have a provision that when you died that X percentage went to X, Y, and Z, and it was just gone at that point?
Yes. The question was, can you have an agreement with the public charity in a donor advised fund context that says, after I die, kill the donor advised fund, give the money to XYZ charity? Absolutely you can, yes. And that's perhaps, and that's common too in the context of private foundations. Certainly have plenty of clients who say, I've enjoyed managing this private foundation during my lifetime, but it is not one that I have designed to be generational. Because oftentimes I hear, because I don't trust my children and their stupid political beliefs to make good decisions, right? So I'm going to say when I die that the money goes to the charity I care about. These are terrific questions and comments. I'm really appreciative of the participation. What else?
Wish you could put an IRA money into donor advised funds, but you can't do that.
Well, I feel like you and I have been on the same page of segues like this whole time. Whenever I give talks like this, I like to leave with one practical tip. And one practical tip that is sort of changing subjects a little bit is charitable giving from retirement accounts. For those of you that are required to take your required minimum distribution because you're 73. I don't think I see anybody in here who's 73, but when you guys get there, the giving the RMD directly to charity, not taking it into income and then sending it out, which is tax inefficient. If you're going to give money to charity anyway, only if you're going to give money to charity anyway, super efficient to have it go from your IRA directly. You're right, sir, that there are some limitations on where that can go. But that is an easy practical tip for people who may in the future be required to take distributions from their retirement account. If you're thinking about charity anyway, send it on.
What are the tax consequences involved in that?
You get a deduction for the money that you send out, and you didn't take it into income. So it's a really efficient tax consequence.
Another thing you can do, Matt, is make a beneficiary of your IRA a charity. If you have these taxable assets that are going to get a step-up in basis and you have a big IRA, you could give some of your IRA to charity if you're done, and they don't pay the tax.
Terrific comment. The comment was that if you're going to give a portion of your estate to your kids, and if you're going to give a portion of your estate to charity, give your kids tax-efficient assets and give charity tax-inefficient assets, right? Because charities don't have income tax applicable. So, as Sarah says, give to charity your IRA, which your kids are going to have to take out over a 10-year period and take into as ordinary income. Give that to charity. Give your kids your Philip Morris stock, as the example I used earlier, that had no basis on it and now has full basis, so they can sell without any income tax consequences. So that's a terrific, terrific comment. Good place to end?
I think we're good. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yes, sir.
Will we have access to these slides?
Sure.
We can get them.
Yeah, I can send
Yeah,
it out.
we-
Absolutely. I'm happy. Send me an email. I'll send it to you.
Yeah, we'll send
Or,
it out.
or you can send them out. Sure, feel free. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, yeah.
These slides, my firm would like me to tell you, are not legal advice, sir. And they are merely for informational purposes only.
Yes, yeah.
And just so everybody knows, you probably know this, but these, we're filming all these seminars, so they're all archived on the website too. So if you ever want to go back and, you know, I forgot what he said about this or whatever, you can go back and watch the presentation again. So
That's terrific. And my email address is there on the slide, so if you have follow-up questions, you don't hesitate to reach out.
all right, well, thank you, Michael, for your time. Thanks everybody for attending. I'm sure if you got offline questions, Michael probably hang out for a little bit afterwards. But thanks again, everybody, for coming, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.